In order for plants to grow, they need inputs of carbon dioxide, water, and energy. The chemical process by which plants use these resources to manufacture glucose, the building blocks of plants, is called photosynthesis. In the process, oxygen gas is produced as a byproduct. The energy for photosynthesis originates in the sun and arrives at the earth as sunlight. This light has both a wave and a particle nature. The particles, or photons, are the smallest units of light. Photons oscillate along a path, which is measured as wavelengths. The light emitted from the sun contains photons in a wide spectrum of wavelengths, called the electromagnetic spectrum. Photosynthetic organisms use only a small portion of the electromagnetic spectrum, called visible light. Photosynthetic organisms contain pigments that facilitate the capture of wavelengths of light in the visible light range. The color of the pigment comes from the wavelengths of light reflected. Plants appear green because they reflect yellow and green wavelengths of light. Red and blue wavelengths of light are absorbed by these pigments and provide the energy that is used for photosynthesis. Within eukaryotic photosynthetic organisms, also known as photoautotrophs, the chemical reactions of photosynthesis occur within plant cells in specialized structures known as chloroplasts. Photosynthesis consists of two sets of reactions, the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. Within the chloroplast are small disc-like structures called thylakoids, which are surrounded by a fluid-filled space called the stroma. The reactions that synthesize glucose, the Calvin cycle, occur in the stroma. The light-dependent reactions occur in the thylakoid. It is here that conversion of light energy to chemical energy is initiated. In most photosynthetic organisms, thylakoids contain pairs of photosystems, called photosystem 1 and photosystem 2, that work in tandem to produce the energy that will later be used in the stroma to manufacture sugars. The photosystems of the thylakoid consist of a network of accessory pigment molecules and chlorophyll, the molecules that absorb the photons of light. Within the pigment molecules, the absorbed light energy excites electrons to a higher state. Photosystems will channel the excitation energy gathered by the pigment molecules to a reaction center chlorophyll molecule, which will then pass the electrons to a series of proteins located on the thylakoid membrane. Photons of light strike photosystems 1 and 2 simultaneously. We will examine what happens with the photons striking photosystem 2 first. The energized electrons are passed from the reaction center of photosystem 2 to an electron transport chain. The electrons lost by photosystem 2 are replaced by a process called photolysis, which involves the oxidation of a water molecule producing free electrons and oxygen gas. While this oxygen gas is a byproduct of photosynthesis, it is an important input to the cellular respiration pathways. As electrons pass through the electron transport chain, the energy from the electron is used to pump hydrogen ions from the stroma to the thylakoid, creating a concentration gradient. This gradient powers a protein called ATP synthase, which phosphorylates ADP to form ATP. The low-energy electrons leaving photosystem 2 are shuttled to photosystem 1. Within photosystem 1, low-energy electrons are re-energized and are passed through an electron transport chain where they are used to reduce the electron carrier NADP+ to NADPH. When the chloroplast is receiving a steady supply of photons, NADPH and ATP molecules are rapidly being provided to the metabolic pathways in the stroma. Therefore, the ATP and NADPH formed during the light-dependent reactions are used in the stroma to fuel the Calvin cycle reactions. The Calvin cycle consists of a series of reactions that reduce carbon dioxide to produce the carbohydrate glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. The cycle consists of 3 steps, the first of which is carbon fixation. In this step, carbon dioxide is attached to ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate, resulting in a 6-carbon molecule that splits into 2 3-carbon molecules. The second step is a sequence of reactions using electrons from NADPH and some of the ATP to reduce carbon dioxide. In the final step, ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate is regenerated. For every 3 turns of the cycle, 5 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate are used to reform 3 molecules of ribulose 1,5-bisphosphate. The remaining glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate is then used to make glucose, fatty acids, or glycerol. It takes 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate to make 1 molecule of glucose phosphate. Thus, the Calvin cycle has to run 6 times to produce 1 molecule of glucose. These molecules can remove their phosphate and add fructose to form sucrose, the molecule plants use to transport carbohydrates throughout their system. Glucose phosphate is also the starting molecule for the synthesis of starch and cellulose. Plants produce sugars to use as storage molecules and structural components for their own benefit. By utilizing the energy of the sun, along with inputs of water and carbon dioxide, plants act as glucose factories. Photosynthetic organisms are the primary producers of glucose on the planet. They also produce oxygen gas as a byproduct, and thus serve as the foundation of life, providing food and oxygen for the complex food webs on both land and in the oceans.
If you look at the flowering plants, which are also called angiosperms, then the flower represents the sexual part of that plant. On the other hand, if you look at non-flowering plants, which are also called the gymnosperms, then these cones, they represent their sexual parts. But you know what? Flowers are beautiful. And so in this video, we will look at the different parts of the flower, and we'll focus more on something called unisexual and bisexual flowers and look at some of their examples. So let's get rid of that and focus on the flower. The flower can be broadly divided into 4 parts. This middle part that you find over here, we call it the carpel. You can also call it pistil. Now it turns out that carpel and pistil are not exactly the same. They have some differences, but the difference is only important when we deal with more complicated carpels. But as of now, we can just call them, for such simple flowers, we can just call them the same thing. So you call them carpel or pistil, doesn't matter. But what's important is that the carpel or the pistil, that is the female reproductive part of the flower. So I'm just gonna call this the female reproductive part. I'm just gonna write female reproductive, okay? Now, why do we say that the carpel is the female reproductive part? Because it is the carpel that is responsible in production of egg cells. Carpels make egg cells somewhere over here. And so just like how in animals, the female reproductive part makes the egg cells. So any reproductive part which makes the egg cells is often called the female reproductive part. The next one would be stamen. So these are the stamen. We have 4 stamens in our flower. The stamen, they are the male reproductive parts. So let me write that over here. Oops. All right. So the stamen are the male reproductive part. Any guesses why it's called the male reproductive part? Well, because it is where the sperm cells are made. Sperm cells. Again, just like in animals, The reproductive part that creates the sperm cells, we call them the male reproductive part. And the whole idea behind sexual reproduction is that the sperm cells need to go and fuse with the egg cells. But we'll have to wait for that action. It's going to happen in the future videos. For now, let's only concentrate on the parts of the flower. So we are 2 down, 2 more to go. And yeah, before we proceed, one important thing, whenever I get confused between these names, right, what I do is I remember stamen has the word men in it. And that's how that helps me to remember that stamen is the male reproductive part. Something to help me remember. All right, now let's go to the third one. The third one is probably the easiest one to remember. It's the petals. What do they do? Well, you know, they make the flower attractive. And so the main job is to attract insects like bees and butterflies, even birds. Why? Because as we will see in the future, they play a huge role in the reproduction. You may have heard of this thing called as pollination, right? We'll talk about all of that fun stuff in the future videos. But the petal's job is basically to attract the insects. And finally, that brings us to the fourth part, the sepals. The sepals played an important role in protecting this flower even before it blossomed. You might know that before the flower blossoms, it's a bud, right? And so what's covering that bud? It's the sepals. It's a sepal that protects the things inside from maybe getting eaten or anything. So their main job of the sepal was to protect, let me just write that, was to protect the young flower, I would say. The young bud. Of course, now that the flower has blossomed, its job is done, but nevertheless, it did play an important role in its life. So these are the 4 parts of the flower. And of course, in the future video, we'll dig a little deeper and look at the parts of the carpel and the stamen separately. But what I want to tell you now is that in this particular example, we are seeing that both the female and the male reproductive parts are on the same flower, right? Such flowers are called bisexual flowers. Why? Because they have both the sexes on the same flower, bisexual. But in some cases, we will find they will only contain either the male reproductive part, the stamens, or they will only contain the female reproductive part, the carpels. In such cases, since they contain only one reproductive part, we will call them unisexual flowers. So let's take some examples. If you look at lilies, then they are bisexual. Why? Because if you look carefully, you can see the carpel, the female reproductive part, and you can see the stamens as well. These are the stamens, the male reproductive part. Both are present, so it's bisexual. Another famous example is hibiscus. If you look carefully, you can see this female reproductive part, the carpel. Of course, the carpel is a little complicated. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 carpels fused together. So it's a little complicated, but what's important is that you see the female reproductive part, and you also see the stamens over here. These are all the stamens, the male reproductive part. Because both are present, this is a bisexual flower. On the other hand, if you look at papaya flowers, if you look at the top flower, what you're seeing are only the carpels. Of course, there are 5 carpels over here, but only the female reproductive part is present, only one sex. Therefore, this is a unisexual flower. And since only female reproductive parts are present, we will call that as the female flower. On the bottom, we have another papaya flower itself, but this one only contains the stamens, the male reproductive part, and therefore this one will be a unisexual male papaya flower. Now at this point, you might say, that's great, I understand unisexual and bisexual flowers, but here's the problem for exams. In exams, they ask us to list out the flowers which are unisexual and which are bisexual. How do we do that? How do we remember which flowers are unisexual and bisexual? Here's what I do. So whenever I say the word flower, whichever flowers come to your mind, most of the famous flowers that you might know of, like sunflowers, lilies, hibiscus, lotus, daffodils, tulips, roses, marigold, whichever famous flower you can think of, those are all bisexual flowers. That's a clue to remember bisexual flowers, the most famous flowers you can think of. All right. On the other hand, when I talk about big fruits or big vegetables, Think big fruits, big vegetables, like papaya, or jackfruit, or watermelon, or pumpkin, bottle gourd. So big vegetables and big fruits, turns out their flowers are usually unisexual. Now, of course, there is no rule like that. This is just a way to remember. For example, if you take mango, which can also be big, right? Turns out mango flowers are bisexual. So don't think of it as a rule. It's just a way to remember unisexual and bisexual flowers, especially for our exams, okay? That's pretty much it. So to quickly summarize, what did we see in this video? We learned the 4 parts of the flower, and then we saw that if both the carpel and the stamen are present on the same flower, both the sexes are present on the same flower, we will call them bisexual flowers. And how do we remember it? Well, the most famous flowers you can think of, they're all bisexual. And if you have only one of the sexes present on the flower, either just the carpels or only the stamens, then we will call them unisexual flowers. And how do we remember it? Remember big fruits and big vegetables. Not all of them, but like papaya, jackfruit, pumpkin, their flowers tend to be unisexual. Flowers use their beautiful petals and fragrance to attract insects. Why do they do that? Because the insects help them in pollination. So in this video, we're going to see what pollination is, and what are the different types, and how exactly do the insects help. So let's start with what is pollination. Pollination is simply the act of transferring the pollen grains from the anther, these are the anther, the top part of the male organs, to the stigma. Stigma is the top part of the female organ. So let me just show that. Here is the pollen grain sitting on the anther, top part of the male. Here's the stigma, top part of the female. The act of transferring that pollen grains from the anther all the way to, from the anther all the way to stigma, that's basically what we call pollination. That's what pollination is all about. Now, based on whether the pollen grains are transferred within the same plants or they're transferred between 2 different plants, we can classify them into 2 kinds. So the first one we'll call self-pollination. Self-pollination. And the second one would be something called cross-pollination. Let me just write that correctly. All right, cross-pollination. So let's start with the self-pollination. What exactly is this? So as the name suggests, if the pollen grains are transferred within the same plant itself, then we'll say it's self-pollination. So one way that can happen is if you have pollen grains transferred within the same flower. So from the anther to the stigma of the same flower, this is self-pollination. But even if you have pollen grains transferred from the anther to the stigma of a different flower belonging to the same plant, I'll call this number 2, this is also self-pollination. Why? Because still the pollen grains are being transferred within the same plant. The pollination is still happening, the plant is still pollinating itself. That's the whole idea behind self-pollination, okay? So these are examples of self-pollination. For the first one to happen, the flower needs to be bisexual, meaning it has to have both the male and the female reproductive parts. Only then it can do this. On the other hand, if the flowers are unisexual, then they can still self-pollinate this way. A male flower can transfer pollen grains to a female flower belonging to the same plant. On the other hand, what do you think is cross-pollination? Can you guess that now? What do you think is cross-pollination? Well, cross-pollination is transfer of pollen grains from one flower to a flower of a different plant or a different tree. So for example, if you have pollen grains from here going all the way to the stigma of a different flower altogether, meaning different flower belonging to a different tree altogether, then that is what we call cross-pollination across 2 different plants. Of course, same species, obviously, but 2 different plants altogether. So I'll call this as number 3, This is in pink, so this is cross-pollination. Now you might say, cool, but how exactly does the pollination happen? How do the flowers take the pollen grains and transfer it to the stigma? They don't have any moving parts now, do they? Well, that's a great question. So the pollination depends on certain agents. Let me just write that down. Depends on certain agents. Agents are basically things that help in pollination. One of the most common agent would be wind. So the pollen grains will just get sprayed into the air, and then the wind will be the one that carries it forward. And because both the pollen grains and the stigma is very sticky, when the pollen grain comes very close to that stigma, it'll just stick to it. And of course, in some cases, they are not sticky, but they are very hairy. Even then, the pollen grains will get entangled very nicely with the stigma and they get stuck to it. And pollination happens. So with wind, self-pollination can easily happen because they're very close to each other, right? The stamen, the pollen grains and the stigma are very close to each other. So with wind or water, just like how wind helps in transferring pollen grains for land plants, water will help in transferring the pollen grains in aquatic plants. But what about cross-pollination? Now you see, for cross-pollination to happen, the pollen grains need to get transferred from one plant or from one tree to another. Now, if these trees are very far apart, then the chances of cross-pollination reduces, right? So how do we effectively increase the chances of cross-pollination? This is where the insects come into the picture. So another important agent for pollination, especially cross-pollination, would be insects. Insects like bees, butterflies, moths, and even birds. But how exactly do the insects pollinate? Let me take an example of a bee over here. Let's say this bee is flying and it's a little hungry and it spots a flower. The flower attracts the bees by using its beautiful petals, its odor, and also by using the nectar. Now, what exactly is nectar, you may be asking? Well, nectar is this sugary stuff that the flowers produce near its base of the flower, which has a lot of sugar, it has a lot of protein, so perfect for these hungry bees. So what these bees do, they get attracted to that particular flower, they sit on that particular flower, and they start drinking that nectar. And as they start drinking that nectar, the pollen grain starts sticking to the bees. Let me show you a couple of photos of that. Here on the top, you can see a bee drinking nectar from the flower. And as a result, you can see it's resting its legs on one of the anthers. And so pollen grains can easily stick to the bee. In the second case, you can see a lot of pollen grains sticking to this bee. This bee has been super busy. So coming back to our story, a lot of pollen grains can easily get stuck to this bee. So pollen grains get stuck to that bee. Let me now get rid of this photo. And then when the bee decides to move away, it carries those pollen grains with it. Now the bee goes on its way, on its journey, long journey maybe to its home, and then it spots another similar flower with the similar fragrance and the similar odor. And then again, it gets attracted to it and starts drinking the nectar from that. And while doing that, some of the pollen grains get transferred to the stigma, and that's how cross-pollination can happen. But it's important that the bees need to get attracted to the same species of the flower. For example, if this is a papaya flower, it needs to transfer that pollen grains to another papaya flower and not maybe watermelon flower. And it's for that reason, usually certain bees are always attracted to certain kinds of flower that increases the chances of successful cross-pollination. Okay, bee, you're done your job, go home. These bees turn out to be a major contributor of pollination. Okay. Now, of course, the pollination has happened, but that's not the end of the story. It's actually the beginning of the story. Remember, the sperms inside the pollen grain still need to travel all the way into the eggs, which are found in the ovaries. And that is something we'll talk about in the future video. So what did we learn in this video? We learned about what pollination is, which is basically the transfer of pollen grains from the anther, the top part of the male, to the stigma, the top part of the female organ. And this can happen in two ways. Self-pollination is when the pollination happens within the plant. This can happen within the flower or within two different flowers of the same plant. And cross-pollination is when pollination happens within two different plants. So from one flower of one plant to a flower of a different plant altogether. And then we saw the agents are basically what causes pollination. The examples of that would be wind and water, and certain insects also help in pollination. Pollination is the act of transferring the pollen grains onto the stigma. Great, we have transferred pollen grains onto the stigma. But what happens next? That's basically what we're going to talk about in this video. In this video, we're going to see exactly how the sperm cells are going to reach the eggs and eventually how a new baby plant is born. So let's zoom in on this female part and see what happens after pollination. So here is the pollen grain which has landed on the stigma. Now a couple of things is, first of all, there'll be a lot of pollen grains, and pollen grains are usually much smaller than what I've shown over here. But I've shown them big and I've shown one so that we can clearly focus on and see what's going on. So the sperm cells are going to be produced inside this pollen grains, and the egg cells will be formed inside the ovules over here. So we need to get the sperms from here to there. But how does it happen? It is for this reason the pollen grain starts germinating. So what's going to happen is the pollen grain starts absorbing some of the secretions that are done by the stigma, the sticky stigma, and then the pollen grain starts germinating. And a tube starts growing from this grain. So let me show you. So a tube starts growing from this pollen grain, and the tube will eventually go all the way into the ovary. This is the ovary. It'll go all the way into the ovary and all the way into the ovule. So it makes a path for the sperms and leads them all the way to the ovule where the egg cells are lying. Now at first you may be wondering, well, how does the pollen tube know exactly where the ovules are? Well, it turns out that the ovules over here start secreting some chemicals, and the pollen tube basically senses the chemicals and starts growing towards it. Now we've talked about such motion before. We call this the chemitropism. Tropism means movement, and chemi means movement due to chemicals. Anyways, don't worry too much about that. A pollen tube has now grown, and now we will see some sperm cells, which I'm drawing over here. We draw that over here. A couple of sperm cells. They will start moving through the pollen tube, and they will enter into the ovule. Great. What's going to happen next? Well, let's zoom in on this ovule and find out. So here is the zoomed in version of that ovule. This is that same pollen tube, and this is that ovule. The single ovule I've zoomed in over here. Now, if you look inside the ovule, you'll find the egg cell. That's where the sperms need to reach. But here's the thing. The ovule doesn't only contain egg cells, it also contains some other cells as well. In fact, if you count, it turns out there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and this whole big total 7 cells. This big cell has 2 nuclei inside of it. All right. So it turns out there are total 8 nuclei inside this ovule. But don't worry about it. We don't have to worry too much about it right now. So let's not worry about these other cells. And so now from this pollen tube, the sperms are coming in. So let me just draw those sperm cells. So these are the nuclei of the sperms. They will move, and eventually the pollen tube guides them into the ovule. Now what happens? Well, one of the sperm will unite with the egg cell. So one of the sperms unites with the egg cells, and the other sperm, okay, not this one, the other sperm cell will go and unite with the 2 nuclei. Remember I showed that there are 2 nuclei over here sharing one entire cytoplasm. So that other sperm is going to unite with that. Now the reason why I'm telling you this, even though that's not really important, the reason I'm telling you this is because there are two sperms uniting, one uniting with the egg and one uniting with the other cells, we say there are two fertilizations happening in this plant. And that's why usually in flowering plants, we say double fertilization takes place. Fertilization is basically the uniting of the sperm cells with one of these cells. Okay? But anyways, we don't have to worry about that other sperm and that other thing. So let's get rid of that. We will only consider the fusion of the sperm cell with the egg cell. So when that fusion happens, we now get a new cell. And this new cell, which is basically the fusion of the two, we give a name to that. We call this the zygote. Zygote. So what exactly is zygote? Zygote is the fusion of sperm and the egg. Great, we now have a zygote. What happens next? Well, next, a lot of changes start happening. First of all, the pollen tube has done its job, so it'll start disintegrating. Then we will see that the zygote will start dividing from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to many. So let me show you that. So here it is. We can now see the zygote is multiplying. It's dividing into many more cells. And eventually you will find that the zygote would eventually have divided into many cells to give us this kind of structure. This structure is now ready to grow a future baby plant. So this now is called, let me write that down. This structure is now called the embryo. So you can think of embryo as the future plant. It's going to grow into the future plant. In fact, we can actually identify the parts of the embryo. If you look at these two leaf-like structures, they are called the cotyledons. Let me just write that down. So these two leaf-like structures are called the cotyledons. And their main job is to provide the embryo with all the nutrition, all the food that they need. Once it starts growing, it'll require a lot of food. And remember, we don't have leaves yet. So until the new leaves get formed, the cotyledons are the one that's going to provide them with nourishment when it starts growing eventually. We'll look at that in a second. And then you can see this part over here. And important to see them. And of course, over here, I have drawn two cotyledons, but not all plants will have two cotyledons. Some will have two, which is called dicots, and some plants will have just one cotyledon. We call them as monocots. You may have learned about that previously. Anyways, this part, as you can see in between the two cotyledons, this is the part that eventually in the future will grow into a new shoot. And that part is called the plumule. This will grow into a new shoot. And finally, this part over here, let me write that in a different color. This part, this is something that will eventually come out from here and grow into a new root. So this is called the radicle. So the radicle grows into a new root, the plumule grows into a new shoot, and the cotyledons kind of act like leaves. They're not really leaves, but they act like leaves in the sense they give them all the nourishment needed once it starts growing. And a lot of other changes happen as well. For example, the outer wall starts to become a little hard. And now we no longer have an ovule. We are going to call this as a seed. So the fertilized ovule has now finally got converted into a seed. Great. But what happens to the flower? Well, let's see. So here is the flower. Here is our flower. We are zooming back out now. All right, here is the flower. Here is that particular ovule we're talking about. What are the changes that are happening? First of all, we will see now a lot of ovules would have gotten fertilized. Remember, I just showed one pollen grain, but there are multiple pollen grains which are going to fertilize multiple ovules. So all these ovules have now gotten converted into seeds. They're now seeds. and the unfertilized ones are eventually going to disintegrate. What else is going to happen? Well, we no longer need the stamens, so that stamens will start drying off. We no longer need the petals, so that you will see the petals fall off. And we will now find eventually the ovary. This ovary starts swelling and starts becoming bigger and bigger. Here it is. The ovary starts becoming big, and eventually it's the ovary that's going to grow into a fruit. And there will be seeds inside that particular fruit. So over here I've shown a tomato as an example, but it can be any fruit with seeds in them. Then you can eat that fruit and then sow the seeds. So maybe you can't do that for tomato, but for some other fruit, you may be able to sow the seeds. So the next question is, what happens once you sow the seeds? Well, once you start sowing the seeds, you will now see that first root starts developing from the radicle. Radicle is the part where the root develops, right? Then we will find the shoot starts developing from the plumule. Remember, we just talked about that. Let me show you that. So from the radicle, the roots are coming. From the plumule, the shoot is coming. And the cotyledons, these two things are the cotyledons. The cotyledons become massive. They swell up and they almost take up the entire seed. These are now the cotyledons. It's the cotyledons that are providing them with all the nourishment needed to grow. They're giving them all the food to grow. And then as time passes by, we will now find that eventually that shoot starts growing into new leaves. And now the leaves, the first leaves can now, true leaves we call them, can now start photosynthesizing and can start making the new food. And now no longer cotyledons are needed. So the cotyledons eventually get drained. They will now start shrinking, and eventually the cotyledons go away. They will shrink. And finally, a new baby plant is born. The roots can keep on growing. The plant can keep on growing. And once the plant becomes mature enough, the plants can grow new flowers. And the flowers can get pollinated. And now the cycle can repeat. This process of new plants growing from a seed, by the way, is what we call germination. And so this, in short, explains how fertilization happens in plants. So to quickly summarize the important points, after pollination, a pollen tube starts growing and it directs the sperm cells all the way into the ovule. Once the sperm cells reach the ovule, one of the sperm fuses with the egg cell. This process of fusion is what we call fertilization. And the new fused cell is what we call a zygote. The zygote can now multiply, divide into many cells, and eventually forms what we call the embryo. The embryo is the future plant. The cotyledons of the embryo are going to nourish it once the seed starts germinating. The radicle is where the root grows, and the plumule is where the shoot starts growing. At the same time, the flower loses all its other parts. The ovary swells and becomes the fruit. And eventually, as the plant grows, the cotyledons shrink, and now the leaves take care of all the nourishment and the food requirement of the plant.
Hi, it's Mr. Anderson, and in this podcast, I'm going to be talking about plant control. So if we were talking about animals, we'd be talking about the brain, the nervous system, muscles, sensory system, how we respond to our environment. But plants don't have any of those things. And so how are they able to do things like this? Mealworm is placed on a Venus flytrap and it closes quickly, digesting it eventually. So we're not quite sure, but basically we think there's some active transport going on that's pumping water down here to the end, swelling up those cells and then closing in on it. There's a misconception where a lot of kids think that somehow they are eating this. They don't do photosynthesis. Nah. Venus flytrap live in an area where there's not a lot of nitrogen in the soil. It's kind of a swampy area. And so they're still doing photosynthesis, but they're eating these bugs just to get nitrogen that's not really available in the soil. And so if they don't have nervous system, if they don't have muscles, basically what they're using is similar to our endocrine system. They're basically sending out hormones. Those hormones are diffusing around the plant, and then they're going to have different consequences depending on what cells are picking it up, and different actions depending on what hormone is sent. And so the 5 that we're going to learn are going to be auxin, cytokinins, gibberellins, abscisic acid, and then finally ethylene. And so there are a lot of other hormones that are out there, but basically these are 5 ones that are found in a number of different plants. And so it's a good place to start. So let's start with auxin. It's really one of the first ones that was ever studied. And so if you put a plant next to the window and just let it sit there for a long time, what you'll find is that plant is going to start to orient itself towards the sun. And you can see all of these leaves are pointing towards the sun, and they're also going to move throughout the day. And so how do they do that? Well, one of the first scientists ever to do any work on auxin was Charles Darwin and his son. And basically what we found out is that auxin is a chemical. And basically what auxin will do is auxin is going to move to the shady side of a stem. And so if we've got auxin here, auxin is going to migrate to the other side. Let's say that the sun was now on the other side, then the auxin is moved back to this side. But basically what the auxin does is it's going to loosen up the cellulose in the cell wall. And as we loosen it up, it's basically going to make those cells a little bit bigger. And so I couldn't quite do this in the animation, but if you think about it, if the auxin were to move to this side of my finger and make that side of my finger longer, it's going to bend in that direction. Likewise, if it were to move to this near side or my palm side of my hand, it's going to bend it in the other direction. And so basically, depending on where the auxin goes, it's going to make the cells grow faster there, and it's going to make it bend in the opposite direction. Likewise, if auxin moves up to the top, it's going to make it go farther and farther. It's going to grow straight up. And so it's a great way for them to know which way the light is. Auxin's also going to affect the roots. It's basically what's going to happen is auxin's going to move against gravity. And if you think about that, how's that going to play out in the roots? Well, let's say that we have a root. Let's say we tip our plant on its side, and now we have a root that looks like this, and we've got a little root cap on it like that. Well, gravity's going to be pulling us down like this. And so auxin's going to move towards the top. So auxin's going to move up here. Well, what's that going to do? It's going to cause the root to grow more on this side, and that's going to cause the root to bend down. So it's going to go like that. And so it's basically, auxin's a great way for us to respond to our environment. Next one is going to be something called cytokinins. Cytokinins, if you break down the word, it's really easy to figure out this one. It's basically cytokinesis. So we're taking one cell and we're dividing it in 2 cells. And so when does this happen? Well, if you think about it, a plant is going to grow in 2 different directions. There's going to be a plant that's going to grow up like this, and so we have this is going to be moving up. But there's also going to be lateral growth, so it's going to be movement in this direction. And so if we're moving in that direction, we can't just expand our cells. We're actually going to have to make new cells. And cytokinin is responsible for that. It's basically a hormone that causes our cells to divide, and that's going to cause us to grow to the side. And so if you think about it, we can respond to light that way. And so let's say that we have sun up here. So here's our sun again, smiling away. And let's say that there's nothing in the way. Well, then a plant is going to secrete a lot of auxin, so it can grow right up towards the sun. But let's say that we put something in the way. Let's say we put a barrier here so the light can't get through. Well, now a plant is going to increase the amount of cytokinins. That's going to cause more lateral growth, and so it can grow around like that. Once we get pure light again, then we're going to use auxin to grow right up towards it. And so that's, I mean, if you look at a forest, basically everything in the forest is in competition with itself, trying to get the most light. This is a cool little study here. Basically what they did is they applied nothing to this plant, a control, and then they applied a lot of cytokinins to this one. And you can see, even though they're the same age, this one is growing up laterally and this one's it's dividing. Next thing we have is the gibberellins. Gibberellins actually comes from an old story. And basically we had rice, and rice was growing in rice fields or rice paddies. And a fungus infected it. It's called gibberellic. I can't remember. It's a Japanese term. I'm not sure of the species name. But basically what it did is it caused the rice to grow incredibly fast and then fall over and then die. And so basically they called it foolish seedling, because all the rice would grow as quickly as it couldn't support its own weight, and then it would fold over on itself. And basically what we found is it was causing those plants to increase gibberellins, which is a natural plant hormone. And basically what that's used to do is to control the the yearly cycles of the plant. It tells them when it's time to become dormant, when to flower. Humans have started using gibberellins because we can cause seedless grapes to actually grow really, really quickly just by spreading it on them. Next one is abscisic acid. Abscisic acid, I always remember that as like the scissors, like a garden scissors. Basically what abscisic acid is going to do is it's going to do the opposite of what gibberellins are doing. And so in the fall, when our amount of daylight starts to drop off, at least here in Montana, then the trees are going to turn colors. And so how does the plant know when to do that? Well, they're looking at the quality of the light and the amount of light that they get. But basically what that abscisic acid is saying, it's time to cut off those leaves, and basically it causes them to fall. It causes them to suppress this fruit formation. It causes them to stop transpiration. And so I think of abscisic acid as basically a hormone that's causing everything to slow down and enter into dormancy. And then the last one I want to talk about is ethylene. Ethylene, unlike the other ones, is actually a gas that's going to go outside of the parts of the plant. And so this is used in a positive feedback loop. And you've probably noticed that all the fruits on a tree will all ripen at the same exact point. And so basically what happens is if you get fruit that starts to ripen, so these apples right here, ripening fruit will start to give off ethylene, this gas. That ethylene will spread to all the fruits around it, causing them to give off more ethylene, and pretty soon all of them have started to go to become ripen at the same time. And this is super smart because you can attract things like birds and humans so they can eat the fruit and transfer the seeds somewhere else. And so again, positive feedback loop, and ethylene we find in different plants as well. So you could take a really moldy banana, put it right next to some apples, and they're going to go moldy quickly as well. And so basically those are hormones. It's how plants control and respond to their environment, and I hope that's helpful.